There's something to be said about the way Capcom develops their games. They seem to have a certain charm and appeal to them that sets them apart from every other discernible game developer. This has resulted in them creating some of the most prolific and astonishing franchises to date, and it wouldn't be amiss to say that many of them propelled their respective genres to stardom, whether that be in the form of survival horror's founding pillar, or a game that single-handedly popularized a genre to the point where it completely dominated the space throughout the 90s. Capcom has no shortage of stellar feats tucked away behind that seemingly simple logo. Among this stacked library, there lies another monumental franchise, and while it hasn't reached the same heights as those previously mentioned, it still remains the godfather of its own subgenre. The franchise in question is none other than Devil May Cry. Okay, that wasn't nearly as cool as I had hoped. I apologize to anyone that has played these games. For reference, this is what I was going for. That phrase has its own fanbase, and I think it's one I'm about to join. Now, when it comes to my personal experience with these games, I don't have any. See, I never did have a PS2 while growing up. I was more of a GameCube and Xbox kid, so my only exposure to the franchise were a few frequent play sessions of DMC3 which my friend owned. I can't say I remember too much about these sessions, but if there was one thing I do remember, it was the constant ass beating this game gave me. Then again, I was, like 10 years old or something at that point in my life? I mean really, how hard could these games have possibly been? Now, in order to rank these games from easiest to hardest, I have recorded every single death experience while playing through each of these games. Now, there is an interesting distinction we have to make with these games in particular. See, when compared to other franchises I've covered in a similar format, DMC is the first one to include the ability to heal. Now, if used in a practical manner, this mechanic in theory would significantly reduce the number of times one would die or game over. With that in mind, I added an extra penalty to using heals, such that a small heal would add an extra death to my counter, whereas a large heal would add 2 deaths to my counter. Not only did this deter me from using heals in the first place, but it also helps account for potential deaths that may have happened if I had never healed in the first place. At the end of it all, we'll tally up the deaths from each game, and I'll explain, as someone who's playing these games for the first time, why certain aspects of each game make them more difficult than others.
Let's rock, baby.
Now, despite Devil May Cry's influence on the hack and slash genre, this game actually starts off with Dante getting his ass kicked by Trish before whipping out his guns to deflect her bike back at her. Do remember this point, as it becomes important later on. Following this short cutscene, we find ourselves on Marley Island, and it's here where our adventures begin. No, seriously, the game just throws you in right here. What? Were you expecting a tutorial? This is the early 2000s we're talking about, so there's absolutely no hand-holding here. Because this was my first time playing these games, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing at first. I thought the only way to shoot your guns was to jump first. I didn't know that delayed inputs meant different attack combos. I didn't even know there was a lock-on feature that allowed you to fire your guns as well as dodge roll. These are aspects that the game wants you to learn through playing, and boy, was I forced to learn. No! Someone please help me! Thankfully, the game starts off fairly tame by throwing a few marionettes at you. Marionettes aren't overly aggressive and are susceptible to hit stuns, meaning they're extremely easy to deal with in one-on-one instances. There's just one problem though. These guys are never alone. Wait, I'm dead? Dude, it's been like 2 minutes. This underground area in the first mission is a bit of a slap in the face. The arena is massive and there are multiple variants of the marionettes. Some of them even come equipped with ranged weapons that you can't even see coming due to the game's camera. I should mention that by this point I still hadn't learned how to lock on and pretty much was just spamming the same 3-button combo while jumping to shoot every now and then. Even so, outside of that one death, I managed to make this scuffed playstyle work for a good while. Enemies like these Sin Scissors weren't too threatening, mainly due to our new weapon unlocks. The shotgun's knockback effect in particular felt extremely strong as it made dispatching hordes of marionettes much easier. That being said, Mission 2 ends with us unlocking the pathway to the cathedral, and it's here where our first roadblock awaits. Before we get to that though, I should mention that this game has a few collectible items, mainly the different coloured orbs. For those who haven't played Devil May Cry, each one of these orbs plays a crucial part in powering up Dante, either by granting him more HP or the ability to unlock new abilities. Again, I had no idea what I was doing at this point, so I just bought the cheapest stuff at each divinity statue and moved on. Let's get back to that roadblock, shall we?
I'm in danger!
This here is Phantom, the gatekeeper who offers you 2 coloured pills. This boss fight acts as a wake-up call, pretty much signaling to the player like, hey, that shitty playstyle you've been using to get by won't work against me. And if my first attempt was anything to go by, that couldn't be more true. What is... oh my god, my damage. Phantom was designed as a counter-attacker, as most of your attacks won't even be able to pierce his stone-like exterior. He's quick to punish aggressive behaviour, and his attacks do a significant amount of damage, especially for this early on into the game. By this point I had finally learnt how to lock on, which did mean I was beginning to dodge some of his attacks. Now, I'm no gaming prodigy, but I am confident in my ability to learn and adapt. And with each new attempt, I did get closer and closer to defeating him, until I finally got him down on my 4th attempt. It's embarrassing to say, but I felt extremely accomplished even after dying 3 times to the same fucking spider. I guess that's part of the appeal of these games. With my confidence at an all-time high, I confidently marched my way down the hallway towards... Bro, piss off, just go away, stop following me, dude, what the fuck? As difficult as Phantom was, things were only going to get harder from here. Even non-boss enemies began to show up and put up a decent fight. Case in point, Shadow. This guy has some nasty attacks that deal a considerable amount of damage. Furthermore, the methods in which you defeat him far exceed any other non-boss enemy by this point. I died twice before realizing you had to shoot him in his saber-tooth form and melee him while he was in his core form. Like most things in this game, experimentation and practice proved vital. From here we collect the death sentence and use it to summon our mirror image. Except it's not our mirror image, it's the game's first real skill check. I came into this fight fully expecting to be bent over and arse blasted, so I approached it far more cautiously than I had done with Phantom. Just like Phantom though, Nelo Angelo likes to punish your mistakes as he's able to block a lot of your hits before retaliating with some of his own. He's faster than Phantom and he can also cover longer distances in an instant. Not only that, he's also far tankier and shifts the arena in which you fight him 3 different times. Angelo doesn't learn any new tricks between each of these phases, but the scuffed camera can lead to you taking some additional damage, which only adds to this challenging fight. Now I know veterans of this game have been eyeing those symbols underneath the health bar and thinking, does this guy even know what those are for? And the answer to that is no. In fact, the first time I activated Devil Trigger was by complete mistake, when I accidentally hit the bumper button on my 3rd attempt or so, and honestly it was most likely my saving grace when it came to beating Angelo. Another thing I should quickly mention are these yellow orbs. These allow the player to restart from the current checkpoint, but should you run out of them, every death thereafter will send you back to the start of the mission, meaning I had to go back and fight Shadow every single time I died to Angelo. This might seem like a small inconvenience, but it certainly adds a layer of difficulty to this game specifically, as later entries would change the system to always respawn you at the nearest checkpoint. That being said, Angelo only has a limited moveset at this stage in the game, so after a few attempts I did manage to take him down. Now I can't in good faith talk about this game without drawing attention to the obvious camera issues. I know the game came out decades ago, but there were numerous instances where the camera unintentionally makes the game far more challenging. Whether it was during that small sewer area where you face off against a death scissor, or against Griffin, there were plenty of instances where I just had no idea what the fuck was going on because I couldn't see anything. This led to a few instances where I had to use healing items because I just couldn't bring myself to go through the same bullshit again. I must have been halfway through the game at this point, but I was seriously getting into it. I definitely wasn't using optimal combos, and I was still being punished by stronger enemies like the fetishes who had counter attacks built into their kits. Yet I managed to push through each mission with relative ease. The only times I did perish were in situations where I was overrun by numerous enemies at once. Even so, I'd like to think I was getting better, and the second fight against Nelo Angelo proved to me that this was the case.
Oh, look at the cleanse, look at the moves!
Sure, he still kicked my ass the first time around, but overall the second fight is pretty much just the first fight, but in a tighter, more compact arena, meaning it's theoretically harder to dodge most of his attacks. That being said, because we faced him before, the player should know how to dodge most of his attacks by this point, and while it got pretty dicey at times, I did manage to defeat him on my second try. From here we board a ghost ship that not only has some of the most awkward underwater levels, but also another fight against my favorite boss. Huh? Bro, what are these fights? Thankfully these missions are relatively short, and Griffin, as annoying as he is probably the easiest boss in the entire game. You know who isn't easy though? This heaping pile of shit. I find Nightmare to be pretty ironic. He's portrayed as this amalgamation of evil, while also being an amalgamation of the most annoying boss qualities all tied up into one. To even damage this guy, you need to light up these rune wheels which will expose his core. While you're doing this though, he'll be throwing out attacks that range from quick stabs, to miniguns, to hyper beams. On their own, they aren't necessarily the hardest things to dodge, but when you're facing the rune wheels and he's off out of the camera, you're in prime position for some serious backshots. This first encounter isn't nearly as bad as the latter ones, as they take place in smaller and smaller arenas, and I think we know just how well the camera works in these situations.
Man, I just can't see anything. What the fuck's going on?
Now after that nightmare, get it? The game throws a few new enemies at the player. The frosts and plasmas highlight the importance of using specific weapons when dealing with certain enemy types, but I wouldn't say either of them prove to be that challenging on their own. The same can't be said about our final duel against Nelo Angelo though. This time he's gone above and beyond, and he's even done his hair in preparation for this ultimate showdown. But at this point we've already faced him twice, so he's probably not going to be that hard. In typical Angelo fashion, his attacks are fast and require precise timing to dodge. He's also quick to counterattack and has a wide range of attacks and abilities to draw from. Now despite dying to him another few times to these attacks, this is by far my favourite fight in the entire game. There's just something about clashing with a humanoid enemy as you dodge their strikes while trying to weave in some of your own in a one-on-one environment that's just so satisfying. He's one of the hardest bosses the game has to offer, yet he's also by far the most fun to fight, which is a notion that can't be used to describe the game's final boss. After we deal with Nightmare one last time, we spare Trish the backstabber, only to then watch her die as we look towards the one true god, Mundus. I think Kamiya has a stylistic preference for his final bosses, now that I think about it. The first phase has us fighting him in an on-rails type shooter. His attacks in this form are pretty simple, but as someone who hates inverted controls, this was more challenging than it needed to be. The main difficulty present in this first phase is any damage you take during it carries on over into his second phase. Yes, this guy has a second phase. Thankfully for me, the second phase wasn't too bad. I'm not sure if he was glitched or something, but his attacks seemed pretty infrequent when I was fighting him. His big attacks do a considerable amount of damage should they hit you, but it felt like they were relatively easy to avoid for the most part, and their windups were pretty long. Damaging him on the other hand was where it got annoying. I couldn't seem to get close enough to him without falling into the lava, so a lot of the time I'd end up popping Devil Trigger before bursting him down from range. Towards the end of the fight, I just decided, fuck it, and just rushed him down in the lava itself. I didn't even realize at this point that the lava can't actually kill you. Upon his defeat, we meet up once again with Trish, who is, yep, she's still dead. Not to worry though, as this allows Dante to pull out those acting chops and deliver this killer line.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light.
And the Oscar goes to...
From here we escape back through the underworld where we face off against Mundus one last time. He's far easier in this form as we shred through him with the help of Trish. Wait, what? The game ends with us soaring across the sky as we head towards Woohoo Island. At the end of Devil May Cry, I had died a total of 22 times. During my ventures, I had also ended up using 4 vital stars. Because each of these stars accounts for 2 extra deaths, this brings our total death count to 30, which is a lot more than I expected out of a 6-hour game. That being said, I'd enjoyed my time so much that I immediately jumped into Devil May Cry 2, a decision that I would come to regret not long after.
Am I seriously fighting a fucking tank? It's not even doing anything.
It's the biggest piece of dog shit.
Just like Devil May Cry 1, I had very little knowledge when it came to Devil May Cry 2, and this time it seems I wasn't the only one. The mystery surrounding this game's development remains one of the toughest ciphers humanity has yet to crack. I mean, we don't even know who developed this game originally.
No shit.
And considering the arse blasting this game has received over the years, I'm sure they won't be exposing themselves anytime soon. Now, with that being said, a lot of people seem to be confused as to how DMC2 ended up in this state. I have a theory that for the most part is bulletproof. See, sequels for any franchise are always derivative to a certain degree. Just hear me out for a second, I promise this is relevant. In DMC2's case, the developers had to have looked back at DMC1 for some inspiration. This is where they were most likely awestruck at just how powerful Ebony and Ivory were in that very first cutscene. Even Trish brought awareness to their power.
What strength?
So, in order to keep things canon, Dante's guns were given the biggest buff known to man, to the point where they could continuously juggle and stunlock enemies while dealing huge amounts of damage. Not only that, but they'd shred bosses, making them not only the easiest weapons to use, but also the optimal weapons in every situation, as you could play safe from range and just hold down the fire button. What do you mean that doesn't sound like fun? What, you want to use melee? Well, too bad, because more than half the bosses in this game force you to shoot at them for minutes on end. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. The game for the most part starts off alright. I mean, we've got Dante making a stylish entrance as he obliterates demons on the way down. We're then introduced to this mysterious woman who...
Till next time, son of Sparta.
Alright, maybe this game doesn't start off too well either. From here we venture on into the first mission of the game, and right from the get-go you'll most likely notice that Dante has access to practically every ability he had in DMC1. Go-to abilities like the Stinger and Air Hike, which you had to purchase with your hard-fought red orbs in the first game, were now readily available from the very first mission in DMC2. I shouldn't have to explain how detrimental these changes are when it comes to balancing a game such as DMC. I mean, just imagine if Kratos started every game with every weapon combo and basic ability unlocked. I get that from a lore perspective, it makes sense that he'd still know how to use all of these abilities from DMC1, but as we've already discussed with his guns, lore accurate doesn't always mean good. Whining aside, how's the actual gameplay? More importantly, is it hard? I don't know, why don't you guys tell me? The game starts with some relatively simple enemies. They seemed extremely passive at this point, but then again, what introductory enemies aren't passive? Even so, I found out fairly quickly just how overpowered these guns were, as I made short work of these. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. Now, just in case you were trying to have some fun and didn't notice how overpowered these guns were initially, the developers made sure you did, as the very next enemy they'd introduce are these flying bird fuckers. These guys rarely come within melee distance. I mean, they rarely even show up on the screen at all, which essentially forces you to just spam your guns at them as you auto-lock between countless enemies that you can't even fucking see. Like, what am I shooting at? What am I shooting at? Sorry. This over-reliance on gunplay extends well beyond your standard fights, with many of the boss fights being far worse. The infested chopper and Nephesturus, I don't care. This building boss guy at least fares a bit better due to him having a second phase, but I mean, he can't even aim a laser in his first phase. Even bosses that incentivize melee combat at first glance have annoying AoE counters that discourage you from getting close again, meaning you'll most likely fall back into blasting them from range with your guns. This results in very little skill expression and no real desire to become better, because the game not only forces you to use your guns in most situations, but it's not really rewarding at all, or even worth it to try and pull off these slick stylish melee combos. By the halfway point, I'd essentially been playing the game on autopilot. I hadn't died a single time, nor had I used a single item. Even if you do somehow get hit by an enemy's attack, the damage they inflict is often negligible, meaning you can essentially face tank most attacks in this game without a care in the world. Funnily enough, the hardest parts of this game in my opinion were the platforming and puzzle segments. I don't even know if I should be calling these puzzles, because they're rather simple, but I still found myself struggling to hit like these two orbs to open this gate in time, or trying to jump between these platforms only to realize that my depth perception must be dogshit. The absolute worst section of this game, however, is the abomination that is Mission 12. This electricity ball thing is downright atrocious. The camera angles are arse, and you have to continuously jump, attack every single one of these hexagon things, all while dodging these ambiguous streams of electricity. It's not fun, it's not challenging, it's just frustrating. You can't even lock onto them because of these Sargassos, who hardly do anything and were literally just put there so you'd lock onto them instead of the shapes you need to hit. Now if you thought you could just kill the Sargassos before targeting the hexagon things, bad luck, because the developers thought of that already. So they infinitely respawn. I mean, why the fuck is that even a thing? Your only hope is to keep jump attacking at them and praying that you'll kill them all before dying yourself. Now the game does desperately try to increase the difficulty with the final bosses, but again these suffer from the same flaws as all the prior ones. The fight against Ares has you running around this massive hall while slowly slicing away at his health. He has some annoying mobs that help protect him, but they're relatively easy to avoid, and Ares himself hardly does anything worth mentioning. Defeating him opens the path into the demon world, where we face off against Argosax the Chaos. Just like Mundus, this guy has two phases. The first one looks like a nightmare ripoff, as he's just an amalgamation of all the bosses we've faced so far. Like every other boss in this game, this just becomes gun spamming and dodging for minutes on end. Thankfully, Argosax's true form has a lot more to it and is probably the only fight in the entire game that offers a reasonable challenge. His attacks are fast, and while they don't do a ton of damage, they're one of the few attacks that actually require you to be sentient to dodge. Unfortunately, I was having such a bad time with this game that I really just wanted to speed up the fight and just started spamming Devil Stars to replenish my Devil Trigger before bursting him down from range. Upon his defeat, the game just ends. After running off into the distance, we find ourselves back at the title screen. No credits, no epilogue cutscenes, nothing. At the end of DMC2, I had died just once to those bullshit shapes. I also used one small vital star during Argosax's first phase, because it was such a long fight and the damage does kind of stack up after a while. This means our total death count for DMC2 is 2. Which is kind of a fitting number, but a far cry from the original in terms of difficulty. Thankfully, because DMC2 was such a colossal fail, series director Hideaki Itsuno, who had essentially been given the impossible task of turning rotten milk into a 3-star Michelin meal, asked personally to be the director for DMC3, vowing to make it the magnum opus of the series as an apology to fans for the disappointing state of DMC2. And boy, did that game live up to that promise. The opening cinematic in this game alone has more storytelling than the entirety of DMC2. These stark differences continue on into the gameplay, where we finally have some enemies that are actually willing to attack you. That being said, the Hell Prides and Lusts found in these earlier missions aren't particularly hard to defeat, as each of their attacks have very obvious tells behind them. Dante himself is back to his vanilla self, meaning you have to upgrade each of his weapons abilities with red orbs once again. That being said, this game introduces different styles, with each one focusing in on a particular playstyle or weapon set. Because I had no idea what these were at first, I decided to stick to Trickster, which was the default style already set. I had also selected Gold mode when asked, and I'm glad that I did, as this meant when reaching a game over, it would take me back to the closest checkpoint rather than the start of the mission. One thing I did notice pretty early on was how generous the ranking and boss bonuses were at the end of each mission. This resulted in me earning a lot more red orbs than I had in previous games. This also meant that I unlocked far more useful abilities much earlier on into the game than I did in the original Devil May Cry. Now, after watching our offers crumble to pieces behind us, we face off against another group of enemies as well as the game's first real boss. The Hell Vanguard reminds me of Phantom in a way. He'll look to parry your attacks while launching counterattacks of his own. He's easier to hit than Phantom was, but his ability to teleport can catch you off guard at first. Because I had gotten so used to mind-numbingly button mashing in DMC2, this guy actually humbled me, and once again taught me what real DMC combat was about. It was a strange feeling. It felt like I had been playing a completely different franchise not too long ago, but this death shocked me back into that DMC mindset as I was forced to dodge while dealing damage of my own. Enemy placement and enemy combinations are things that DMC3 seem to do very well. By the third mission, you're already facing off against Prides and Wraths while getting sniped from above by Enigmas. This alludes to the idea of target priority, as focusing on the grounded enemies proves rather challenging as you're leaving yourself susceptible to the ranged attacks of the Enigmas, who have been purposefully placed in tougher to reach areas. Not only that, but you're forced to play in these enclosed spaces which contain explosive barrels that add an element of environmental damage. This kind of enemy placement was present in DMC1, but it wasn't nearly as fleshed out as it was here. Most of the time in DMC1, the ranged enemies couldn't even get line of sight on you to do any significant damage in the first place, but here, it can get pretty brutal. The true challenge offered by this game, however, comes in the form of its bosses, and nothing made that more apparent than the three-headed gatekeeper of getting good himself, Cerberus. Thankfully, he's chained to the wall, so he isn't too much of a problem. Like I said, his moveset is rather limited because of the fact that he can't move. Keep in mind this guy is the second boss fight in the entire game. His attacks are quick while doing a considerable amount of damage, making for a rather intense fight this early on, and that's not even accounting for the awkward hitboxes on some of his attacks. Wait, that hits me there? Defeating him grants us access to the Temen Nigru, and it's here where the game starts to pile on the difficulty. Within moments of entering this place, I found myself getting railed by blood goyles, being overrun by a seemingly endless number of enemies, and struggling to destroy a spiked ball. No, that last one isn't a joke. I spent 10 excruciating minutes sitting here resetting this fucking ball over and over trying to destroy it. Furthermore, the enemies encountered in this unholy tower require more complex methods to defeat them, and in typical DMC fashion, the game gives you absolutely no hint on how to deal with them. I absolutely loathe the blood goyles. They're fairly agile and have a wide range of attack that can even hit you off screen. Not only that, but the game full on baited me into thinking I had to slash at them with my sword, not realizing that it made them divide up into more. Maybe if Dante shot one of them in the cutscene right before facing them instead of, slashing at it, I'd have known that you had to shoot them first to turn them to stone before dealing damage. The challenges don't end there, however, with every new floor of this tower offering something new, whether that be a spiked obstacle course or trial rooms that have you multitasking between activating crests and defeating an absurd number of enemies. It feels like you're constantly under pressure with no room to take a break. I died multiple times on my ascent towards the peak, and amazingly, not many of these came from the earlier bosses. Now I tend to think of bosses in DMC3 as puzzles. There seems to be an optimal way to beat each one, but you're well within your rights to just use a more blunt and rugged method to defeat them. I for one took the rugged approach when facing off against these bosses for the first time around, as I hardly knew anything about them and focused mainly on dodging their attacks while trying to get in a few hits here and there. This definitely led to longer boss fights, but it proved to be an effective strategy, as I was able to clear Gigapede, Agni and Rudra, as well as Virgil on my first or second attempt. Virgil in particular reminded me of Nelo and Angelo with his blistering speeds and parry-based counterattacks. The similarities between them helped carry me through this fight, as I was able to intuitively dodge many of his attacks despite seeing them for the first time. The bosses to follow shared a similar fate, although they definitely had a few tricky elements to each of them. Nephan and Beowulf in particular were tough bosses, and I was thankful that I stuck with the trickster style as it gave me the tools to dodge the sheer number of attacks they threw out. At this point though, I still felt like I was killing a lot of these bosses in suboptimal ways, and as we'll come to discuss, the depth of the combat system and how you can interact with these bosses far exceeds anything I could have ever imagined when coming into this game. Now after making our way through the admittedly confusing halls of the third floor, we once again clash with our twin brother Virgil. This time, however, he not only has access to Beowulf, but also his Devil Trigger. This means that he slowly regenerates his health while dealing more damage and taking less. His attacks are still incredibly fast, and his use of Beowulf gives him access to a lot of quick gap closers that are tough to dodge at first. He's most definitely a step up from the first encounter, with this one taking me a good few attempts to finally get down. Defeating him leads us into the worst mission in the entire game. I get goosebumps even thinking about it. Not only does this mission introduce the Fallen, who have massive attack ranges and can seemingly phase through ground and walls, but it was a mission that was so confusing that I was forced to watch a video to see how it was done. It's not a particularly hard mission, but it's definitely the most frustrating. You're tasked with finding 3 Orfalcon fragments, which are required to power the elevator in the main room. The problem is these Orfalcon fragments are all in separate areas, and the only way to access these areas is to hit these triggers which will shift the pathways for each door. This means that you'll more often than not end up in a completely random area, or get stuck in loops without even realizing it. If that wasn't bad enough, most of these rooms are filled with the most annoying features like obstacle courses guarded by Dullahans, or parkour zones with rotating spiked wheels that are crowded with blood goyles. I must have spent close to an hour on this one mission alone. Thankfully the levels to follow weren't too confusing. We get to face off against a lady in one of the worst boss fights in the game before having to face off against our own doppelganger. Now this guy is a pure gimmick fight, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that it did take me a minute or two to figure out what I was supposed to do. Honestly, if my guns didn't lock onto these covers here, I'd probably never figure out what you're supposed to do. Once I knew the gimmick though, this fight was pretty simple to finish off. Following this, the game gives you a chance to see how much you've improved as it sets out a boss gauntlet for us. Now technically speaking, you don't have to face every boss again, but I felt like it was a good test to see if I'd actually improved at all. There are a limited number of healing orbs scattered around this area, which meant that we had to beat each of these bosses while taking the least amount of damage possible. Now if you remember back, I mentioned that each of these bosses seemed to have their own little puzzles within them, and it was this gauntlet that taught me how to solve a lot of them. To give you a quick summary, during this boss gauntlet, I learned that you could stand on top of Gigapede. Yes, I didn't even know you could stand on top of Gigapi the first time around. Similarly, I learnt that you could ride on the back of Geryon's carriage, which meant you didn't have to worry about dodging a lot of his rush attacks. I learnt that Leviathan's orb attacks could be used to take out the mobs and that this would reward you with healing orbs, and I also learnt that Rooney and Agni can hurt each other with their attacks and begin fighting. Finally, I learned that Nefan literally yells phrases to signify which attacks she's about to do. You may say that these are all obvious, but I personally had no idea about any of them when I first fought these bosses. It was certainly an eye-opener, and it made me appreciate just how much time was spent on fine-tuning these smaller details. Cerberus still kicked my ass though. I fucking hate this guy. Despite it all though, I managed to work my way through this mission without dying a single time. I did use a heal from memory, I think during the Cerberus fight, and that was because I wasn't sure if death meant I'd have to start the whole level all over again, so I kind of just wanted to play it safe. Following the defeat of all these bosses, we rushed to the top of the tower, where we dive into the demon world to confront the two hardest bosses in the game. Arkham's up first, and this guy truly had the potential to be great. His Sparta cosplay got me hyped for another humanoid duel, but instead what we got was another fight against a blob. The problem with this kind of fight is a lot of its difficulty stems from janky hitboxes and random tentacle attacks that hardly have any kind of tell. It can even hit you from off screen. Not only that, but he's got this piranha attack where you're swarmed by a billion fish things. These guys just rail you, and I never really figured out a decent way of killing them apart from just popping Devil Trigger and phase tanking them. The fight gets a bit better when Virgil joins us, but the lack of Devil Trigger in this phase does make that piranha attack much worse. Even so, I managed to get Arkham down in a few attempts, meaning there was one final challenge left. A duel so legendary that many consider it one of the best one-on-one fights in gaming history. That's right, it's time to take down Virgil once and for all. This third encounter with Virgil is by far the hardest, as he spends a large majority of it in his Devil Trigger form. His regular attacks remain the same, but if he lands even one, there's a good chance that you'll be comboed into losing half your health. His attacks are still insanely fast and even more deadly while in his devil form. This also means he heals constantly, and trying to find openings while he's constantly attacking is extremely tough. This guy killed me over and over and over. And while I got close sometimes, many of my attempts ended in failure. I will admit that I was pretty stubborn, and a lot of my attempts involved me getting far too greedy while Virgil was in his devil form, and being severely punished for it. I figured that it might be easier to avoid his attacks while in DT, and then punish him when he comes out of it. It took a good few attempts, but I finally managed to get to a point where I could dodge most of his attacks and finally take him down. With Virgil defeated, we share our heartfelt moment with him before meeting up with Lady, where we get a title drop.
Even a devil may cry when he loses a loved one.
Thus ending our time with Devil May Cry 3. At the end of DMC 3, I had died a total of 32 times, while using one small heal and 2 large ones. This brings our total death count to 37 deaths, making it the hardest game so far in the entire series. Now, I'm not sure about you guys, but Devil May Cry 4 felt like a soft reboot for the series. For a game that's over a decade old, I was impressed at just how good this game looked. The upgraded engine is one thing, but it's also one of the smaller changes made in DMC4. I mean, we don't even start the game as Dante. Instead, we're introduced to our new protagonist, Nero, a hot-headed guy with a heart of gold. Now, at first, I wasn't convinced. I wasn't sure I'd come to like him as much as I had with Dante, but I'm glad to say that he definitely grew on me over the course of the game. Speaking of Dante, he certainly wastes no time making his flashy appearance even when he's not the main protagonist. You know, we've entered the late 2000s because this is the first game in the series to include a dedicated tutorial. For the purpose of an opening sequence, I can appreciate the fact that we face off against Dante here, but I kind of wish he was a bit more challenging. This fight introduces Nero's Devilbringer and the powers that come with it. These will become increasingly important the further into the game we get, and the combo potential it provides quickly cemented it as one of my favourite additions to the series.
Holy shit, get fucking suplexed, bitch!
After playing around with Dante for a bit, we leave the cathedral before witnessing absolute chaos. We're handed the Red Queen, which Nero is able to rev, causing flammable fuel to cover the blade, which not only increases your damage and attack range, but also changes how certain attacks work. Nero actually demonstrates its power in the very first cutscene, meaning it's available from the get-go. The problem is, I had gotten so used to playing as Dante that I never even noticed I could do this, and it wasn't until I was roughly halfway through the game and had some upgrades that I actually started trying to use it. I'm not even kidding. Now, I advise anyone that's going to get triggered by me not using Exceed to probably skip this part of the video because I really don't use it that much, I'm sorry. Regardless, the first level introduces these scarecrows, which bear a striking resemblance to the marionettes in the original. They have the same basic attack patterns and therefore aren't very threatening. One thing I did notice when fighting my way through this mission was the copious amounts of red orbs I'd gathered. The orbs awarded from enemy kills and even random objects like park benches seemed to be far more than in previous games. That being said, DMC4 changed how you powered up in general. See, in previous games, red orbs were used as the core currency used to purchase new abilities as well as items. In DMC4 though, they introduced Proud Souls, which were a separate currency from red orbs. Red orbs in this game are used to purchase items, like they did in previous games. Proud Souls on the other hand, which are only earned at the end of each mission or when you die, are the prime currency used in upgrading and learning new abilities. Throughout this first mission, the game further highlights Nero's Devilbringer, allowing you to test out both the Buster and Snatch abilities. The Buster in particular is one of the strongest abilities in the entire game. Whether you're picking up scarecrows and slamming them into the ground, or using the Angelo's own weapons to blast them to smithereens, there didn't seem to be a limit on how far you could push this ability, and nothing proved that more than when I fought Burial, the first real boss of the game. In typical DMC fashion, Burial is certainly no slouch. His attacks cover an absurd range, and I found myself struggling to dodge many of his wide slashes. He also has numerous AoE explosions that deal immense damage if you're caught in them, and from what I could tell, he seemed to be fairly tanky. But then again, I wasn't using Exceed, so of course he was fucking tanky. If it wasn't for the houses that gave you green orbs in this arena, I'd consider this one of the hardest first bosses in the series so far. But it wasn't just the forgiving arena that made this fight easier than say Cerberus or Phantom. It was also the way in which Nero's Buster ability interacted with the boss. By this point, I hadn't fully grasped what the Devilbringer could do. I knew I could grab enemies and whatnot, but I assumed those kinds of things only worked on basic enemies. Thankfully though, this assumption was wrong.
What am I doing? What the fuck? Holy fucking shit. Wait, hold up. Oh, get fucking, holy shit.
After discovering this, it seemed like the bosses here were going to have their own little puzzle-like elements, which mainly involved me trying to figure out how Nero's Buster could interact with them to deal immense amounts of damage. Much of the difficulty in DMC4 comes from the boss lineup, just like in DMC3. I think Nero's Devilbringer makes a lot of the basic enemies obsolete, as you're able to close distance far better than you could in the original trilogy, and it even has some crazy AoE potential that not only damages multiple enemies, but can also CC multiple enemies. Honestly, the only enemies that gave me any real trouble were the Mephistos and the Fausts, which now that I think about it, are annoying for all the same reasons that the Fallen were annoying in DMC3. They float around sometimes behind objects, and while their ranged attacks don't do a whole lot of damage, it makes them extremely hard to hit, especially considering you need to buster or snatch them multiple times in order to reveal their true forms. A lot of my earlier deaths just came from stupid ideas, like thinking I could get past this fireball without realizing there was a certain way to do it. Because I was playing using an Xbox controller, I'd gotten so used to using Trickster in DMC3 and therefore dodging with the B button, that in the beginning of DMC4, I would almost always hit the B button to dodge rather than the standard A button. This proved catastrophic in my fights against Bale, who is by no means a tough boss. That being said, he does have a few tricky moves, many of which can freeze you in place, allowing him to follow up with another one of his moves. This Gobble attack in particular caught me off guard quite a bit, but mainly this was because I wasn't dodging properly. I died to this fucking frog 3 times, and while it's embarrassing to admit, I'm kind of glad it happened this early on, as it rewired my brain on how to dodge properly again. That being said, I didn't use the Buster ability once during my attempts, which is very concerning, nor did I ever rev my Red Queen to activate Exceed. It seems I still had a lot to learn, and learn I would, as the very next boss fight practically forces you to figure out the gimmick behind it. Can you imagine how dumb you'd look if you spent 5 minutes slashing at Agnes through a window while doing fuck all damage? I mean, seriously, you'd have to be on the spectrum or something. Like, it could not be me, that's all I'm gonna say.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't.
Yeah, so this containment room boss teaches you just how effective and, well, in this case, necessary the Buster ability is, as you're supposed to use it to pick up these blades and launch them at the glass panel. I unfortunately figured this out too late and perished once as a result. This fight was another eye-opener for me. Yeah, I know, I'm running out of eyes to open here, but it fundamentally changed how I fought the bosses to follow. After breaking our way into the lab area, we absorbed Virgil's Yamato into our Devilbringer, granting us access to our Devil Trigger. Now, despite it being a Devil Trigger, there is a significant difference between this one and Dante's. Dante's Devil Trigger gives him poise, meaning he can't be stunned by regular attacks, and could continue his combos while face tanking multiple hits. Nero on the other hand still gets stunned by basic enemy attacks, even while in his Devil Trigger form. Now this may not sound like a big deal, but as I mentioned before, this can result in you being stun locked or dropping combos if you don't play cautiously. Even so, it's still a strong ability that can pump out immense amounts of damage all while healing you. This paired with the countless abilities Nero has access to makes most enemies and even some bosses a complete joke to deal with. Even Angelo, who I envisioned being a tough fight, wasn't nearly as bad, and while his fast attacks reminded me of Nelo Angelo, the low damage from his attacks as well as the amount of damage you could inflict on him through buster attacks meant that he didn't really pose much of a threat. Unfortunately, the same can be said about Nelo Agnes as well. He had some interesting techniques that did decent damage, but he always seemed to have wide recovery windows, which allowed me to wail on him without worry for the majority of the fight. I remember having this false sense of confidence at this point. I'd just beaten the last 3 or 4 bosses in a row without dying once, and I had really started to get the hang of abusing the buster. My ego was skyrocketing to unforeseen levels, so I needed a good humbling, and who better to do that than the infamous Devil Hunter himself. Now originally I came into this fight thinking I was just gonna beat his ass because of his pathetic performance in the tutorial fight, but I was cocky. This Dante has access to all 4 styles and will switch to them throughout the fight. He's also extremely agile, oftentimes dodging all of your attacks before countering with some of his own. All his signature moves are here, he uses the Stinger to close distance, he's got his Helmbreaker, he counterblocks with Royal Guard and even outguns you with Gunslinger. This guy was out dueling me while I was in devil form. I truly had to slow down and take my time in order to defeat Dante. Following this, we get to beat down on Sanctus for the first time before getting nerfed by the power of love. I guess it's up to Dante once again to save the world.
I'll do it myself.
You'd think after playing as Dante for 20 hours, I'd have the hang of it. He's still got all his signature moves, and you're even able to switch between his different styles on the go now. That being said, I had gotten so used to Nero's abilities, namely his Devil Bringer, not so much as Exceed, that it took me a while to get used to Dante's combos and movements again. Dante is definitely no slouch though, and even though I had never used Swordmaster in DMC3, the added damage potential and combo potential that came from it helped me blitz through room after room of enemies. Unfortunately, Dante's segments are what I'd consider the biggest flaw of DMC4. It has nothing to do with Dante himself, and more so the fact that it has you backtracking through the same stages we completed as Nero. This meant that we faced the same group of enemies and even the same bosses again and again. The bosses hadn't learned any new attacks and felt like more of a slugfest, seeing as I couldn't abuse Nero's buster ability to deal huge damage anymore. The only one I died against was Nelo Agnes, and that was mainly because I got caught in the corner while he was doing his little spinning attack. I think he may be one of the only ones that uses different moves the second time around, but I could be wrong here. Either way, following his defeat, all you have left is to confront Sanctus and this savior. The fight against the savior is, it's... Anyway, Dante shoots the Yamato straight into the heart of the savior, where miraculously Nero is still alive. It truly felt like Dante was passing on the torch to Nero at this point, and it was up to him to stop Sanctus once and for all. Alright, never mind. I think we need Dante here. In all seriousness, Sanctus is very similar to the first time we face him. The main difference seems to be in his recovery speed, as he's able to fire out his attacks at a much faster rate. Not only that, but he's also extremely agile, making it hard to reach him to break his dumbass shield. The hardest part of the fight, and I say that in quotations, is after you drop him to 25% of his total HP. At this point, he'll start spamming dash attacks that are pretty tough to dodge. What you're supposed to do is counter these dashes with your buster, but if you're like me, you'll spend minutes on end just dodging over and over without ever really considering, hey, maybe I should try using my buster here. I legitimately thought this part of the fight was glitched. Again, playing as Dante had rewired how I played the game, and I semi-forgot about trying buster at all. But alas, once I figured it out, the rest of the fight was easy. With Sanctus defeated, we rescue our true love Kyrie, and counter the savior a few more times before having our romantic moment ruined by some scarecrows. At the end of DMC4, I had died a total of 10 times. I also used one small heal, which brings our total death count up to 11. This means it slots right there in the middle, and for what it's worth, I think it's a fairly balanced game in terms of its difficulty, especially for newcomers like me. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about this next game. Well then, looks like I spoke too soon about DMC4 being a soft reboot, because following DMC4, the series would get its own dedicated reboot in the form of DMC Devil May Cry. I must have spent a good 10 minutes in the shower thinking about whether or not I should have even included this game. See, after completing the game, I did some research and found that there was quite a bit of discourse surrounding this entry, with many not considering it a proper DMC game. Apparently having the name of the franchise twice in your title isn't good enough. In all seriousness though, the arguments made against this game mimic those from old Zelda fans who don't consider Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom real Zelda games. That being said, I felt off about leaving out this particular game because at the end of the day, it does technically belong to the franchise. But what exactly is it about this game that turned so many fans off? And more importantly, did it have any significant impact on the notorious difficulty that's become ingrained in the franchise so far? Well, before I had even started playing, I was already stumped. Seeing as I was a newcomer to the franchise, I had been playing each of these games on the standard or normal difficulty. But in DMC Times 2's case, yes, that's how I'm going to be referring to this game from now on, it had two modes that could be classed as normal. Devil Hunter was the normal mode in DMC 4, so that seemed like the obvious pick. But then I read the text underneath Nephilim mode, which said that if I'd played a DMC game before, then this was the mode to pick. So which one's the normal one? I ended up going with Nephilim mode, probably because my ego was at an all-time high, but even now after finishing it, I'm not sure what the true normal mode is. Once the game starts, we get a good look at this new Dante, and I mean a really good look.
What do you mean by that?
Before being thrown into limbo. It's here where we're introduced to the combat of the game, and just like DMC4, we have to go through a short tutorial. One of the first things I noticed was that the dodge roll had been given its own keybind. I actually honestly prefer this over the 3-button input of the older games, as it made dodging far easier and it gives you far more flexibility with your dodges when looking to do other combos. Outside of that though, the rest of the combat felt smooth and responsive. The timing of delayed combos also became more pronounced, and while the animation on combo enders felt longer, they were still extremely satisfying to pull off. Like its predecessors, the enemies encountered during the first mission are extremely basic, with long wind-up attacks and plenty of opportunities to hit-stun them. The mission introduces environmental damage in the form of these gears, but just like the basic enemies, you don't take too much damage, even on Nephilim mode. The mission ends with us facing off against the Hunter Demon. This guy wasn't too bad, but he did showcase just how fast some of the attacks were in this game. I also learned that you can strafe in mid-air, similar to how you could with the Trickster style in DMC 3 and 4, which only made things easier in the long run. The following missions see us acquiring both the Hellish Arbiter as well as the Angelic Osiris. These are special weapons that not only play a large role in the traversal of certain levels, but are often required to take out the uniquely coloured enemies. These unique enemies take minimal damage from any weapon that doesn't directly counter their element. They're pretty simple to take out in one-on-one situations, but as we'll come to see, some of this game's hardest moments involve the pairing of these unique enemies with a group of others. I must say that the early missions felt very easy, and it wasn't until mission 4 where the game started to throw significantly tougher enemies in groups at me that I really started to feel some kind of pressure. These chainsaw guys in particular have super armor during their attack animations, and if you're caught by one of them, you can very well be comboed into oblivion. Unfortunately, the beating my HP bar got during this onslaught didn't bode well against the Tyrant, who's this massive brute type that charges towards you. His attacks are slow, but deal hefty damage, and the recovery window on some of his attacks were much faster than I expected. From this point on though, I seemingly breezed through most of the game. There were a few levels that proved tougher than others, like this one that has you fighting two Tyrants in a lab area while there's acid spilling all over the place. There are a few levels like this that test your positioning as parts of the environment look to damage you as well, but the large majority of them are towards the latter half of the game, and even these don't pose that big of a challenge once you understand the gimmicks behind them. But what about the bosses? Are the bosses at least hard? They have some fast attacks and all, but they really don't put out that much damage, and a lot of them kind of just fall apart once you figure out their gimmick. I can't believe I'm saying this, but most of my deaths in this game were due to fall damage. Now thankfully there's no instant death mechanic if you fall off ledges and whatnot, but you do take a considerable amount of damage each time you do. Now these didn't necessarily kill me straight up, but there were quite a few instances where I had gotten so low on HP just from falling off edges that a few measly hits were all it took to kill me. I also died twice to whatever the fuck is happening here. Wait, what the fuck is going on? Hello? Dude, what the fuck just happened? Outside of these embarrassing displays of platforming though, I hardly died. I managed to push past each level without any struggle at all, and I think a lot of it comes down to the sheer amount of AoE and hitstun these angelic weapons have. These weapons all have a massive range and can single-handedly wipe out a whole room of enemies without you even really trying. Not only that, but Aquila can literally stun lock enemies in place for multiple seconds, essentially neutralizing their threat potential completely. At the end of the game, we find ourselves facing off against Mundus in a pretty simple battle before having to take on Virgil in typical DMC fashion. Now if you haven't played this game, game, you'd probably expect Virgil to be a tough fight. I mean, he was tough in DMC 1 as Nelo Angelo, and he was even harder in DMC 3, so surely he's brutal in this game as well. I mean, he is the final boss after all.
2 seconds later.
Okay, to give Virgil some credit here, he's probably the most fun I had with a boss, but he's certainly not a challenging one. Sure, his attacks are fast, it's Virgil after all, but do you want to see how mighty his damage is?
No, 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 no.
Okay, that was obviously a ranged attack, so surely he does more with his signature slash, right?
My disappointment is immeasurable.
Yeah. I rest my case. Virgil is a complete joke in this game. With him defeated, Dante is finally able to accept the fact that he'll never be him.
I don't know who I am anymore.
And that he's merely a knockoff version of the actual Dante. But hey, at least he ain't the knockoff Virgil. At the end of DMC times 2, I had died a total of 7 times. I used 0 healing items throughout the whole game, bringing our total death counter to, well, 7. Considering I played this one on Nephilim mode, it's kind of shocking just how easy it is compared to every other DMC game outside of DMC 2. With it completed though, there remains one last game, and the only question that remains is where does it fall in terms of difficulty compared to its predecessors? DMC 5 returns to that core gameplay loop that's been apparent since the very start. Nero and Dante re-emerge as the main protagonists of this game, and we're also joined by a mysterious third, simply referred to as V. DMC 5 once again throws us into a combat situation with very basic enemies as it runs us through the tutorial. One thing that becomes apparent pretty quickly is that Nero is missing his Devilbringer, which significantly limits both his damage and combo potential. The prologue has us facing off against Urizen, and this is a fight that we'll be getting very accustomed to over the course of this game. I always assumed it was possible to beat this boss, but at the same time I can imagine the vast majority of us players got railed on the first time through. His attacks aren't overly complex, and while they all have the obvious tells to them, this little crystal defending him has an unbelievable amount of health. As I mentioned earlier, Nero also doesn't have access to his Devilbringer abilities, so it was only a matter of time before I got my ass handed to me. Like I said though, this outcome was what the developers intended, and it's from this point on that we look to take revenge. Following that ass clapping, we learn that a month has passed since Dante's sacrifice. Nero, now fully accepting his main protagonist role, shows off his stylish combat skills while also bringing awareness to the fact that he has a new arm. These mechanical arms are his new Devil Breakers. They work in a similar manner to his Devilbringer, as you're able to pull in enemies, but in actuality, these bad boys have far more utility behind them. We fight through the game's second tutorial, which features the same basic Mpuses. We then make our way towards the game's first mini-boss. See, the health bar might fool you into thinking this is a proper boss, but come on. This mess has like 3 attacks, all of which do hardly any damage and are incredibly simple to avoid. I also noticed that this game seems to award far more red orbs than previous games, but I think it's relatively balanced as we'll need to share these orbs across 3 different characters moving forward. Apart from that though, there isn't too much to say about this opening mission. Nero still uses his trusty Red Queen, meaning we have access to the Exceed ability, all of which helps make quick work of this boss. Going into mission 2, we're taken back in time where we learn that Nero's devil arm was literally ripped off by a mysterious figure. Oh, never mind. It's Virgil, isn't it?
Well, duh.
Back in the present, we're introduced to a new Devil Breaker, and this is something we'll be seeing a lot. See, practically every other mission, Nico has a new Devil Breaker for us to try, and it got to the point where I was getting somewhat overwhelmed by choice, as I barely had enough time to test out the latest one before she threw another 2 at me. That being said, the Devil Breakers make up an extremely important part of this game's combat system, and depending on which Devil Breaker you use, you can make an absolute mockery out of most of the enemies in the game. You have Devil Breakers that stunlock enemies in place, others that replicate Nero's Devilbringer with its overpowered grab attacks, as well as ones that cause your Red Queen to go into overdrive, increasing not only its damage, but its range as you blitz your way around the battlefield, annihilating anything you touch. As you can imagine, with abilities this strong, much of the game is a breeze, especially considering just how frequently the game offers these upgrades. These power spikes only further increase when you count all the upgraded abilities you're buying with the copious amounts of red orbs the game supplies. Now, new Devilbringers aren't the only thing introduced in the second mission. See, after fighting our way through numerous Mpuses, we stumble across a new enemy. Well, somewhat new. Now these guys might look similar, but their movesets are somewhat different as they now feature a charge attack that covers a wider range. There are a few instances where DMC5 will reintroduce enemies from the older games, and while they have slightly different attack patterns, for the most part you're able to use the same techniques from previous games to defeat them. I wouldn't say this makes the game significantly easier, but it does make certain sections less threatening overall, just on the basis of having faced these types of enemies before. Thankfully, the large majority of this game's enemies are completely original, and boy are there some tough ones. Impusa Queens, as the name suggests, are massive Impusas who have wide sweeping attacks. They aren't too much of a problem on their own, but the fact that these queens are usually surrounded by other enemies makes taking them down slightly harder. Other enemies like the Behemoth and Fury are a hassle no matter what situation you find them in, as both of them are fully capable of dealing massive damage and causing absolute chaos. The Fury in particular is an extremely agile demon that has extremely fast recovery times. Their attacks are also clouded by their teleporting ability, which makes them hard to predict at first. Honestly, it's a shame that they appear so infrequently in lower difficulties, as they are by far the most fun to fight. Speaking of fun fights, Mission 2 ends with us facing off against Goliath, who's the first real boss battle of this game. As his name suggests, this guy is an absolute tank, being able to soak up an incredible amount of damage before transitioning into his second phase. His attacks seem to have a massive hitbox, or at least I hope so, otherwise I have some serious beef with the dodging system.
Wait, what? There's no fucking way that hit me. Come on, that is nah.
I definitely underestimated this guy, or maybe I was so used to DMC x2's rolling mechanic that I forgot how to properly dodge in these games, but I did die for the first time against Goliath. Regardless, he doesn't have too many attacks to learn, and I was able to get him down on my second attempt. I will say that this game seems to have far more bosses than previous DMC games, at least earlier in the game, with most missions ending in a boss fight. There's a wide variety of great bosses here. You've got the Elder Gurion Knight, King Cerberus, Cavalier Angelo, and of course Virgil. Unfortunately though, outside of maybe 2 or 3 of them, the rest of these guys are quite easy to beat. DMC5 also seems to suffer from the classic rematch trope, where you'll oftentimes fight the same bosses over and over again. Urizen is the worst offender when it comes to rematches, and what started off as a somewhat challenging fight slowly faded into one that I was able to beat on my first attempt over and over again. Now while we're on the topic of aspects that make the game slightly easier, let's talk about V, that mysterious third character we get to play as. Now I actually enjoy playing as V, maybe not as much as Dante or Nero, but I certainly didn't hate his gameplay. That being said, he's by far the safest character out of the bunch. Not only does he attack from range, meaning he's hardly in range of being hit, but he can have up to 3 summons on the field at once. Not only do they draw aggro, but they can easily hit stun any enemy into oblivion, while doing a significant amount of damage as well. Even when you're forced to defeat mirages of earlier bosses with only 1 or 2 of his summons, they're still incredibly easy to take down. It's because of these reasons that I never chose to play as V when given the choice. One aspect that I haven't really touched on in this game is the removal of vital stars. If you remember, these were your primary source of healing in previous games. They were either collected during missions or purchased with red orbs. This did mean you could stock up on them and heal at any point. It didn't really matter if you were in the middle of a boss fight or not. If you needed to and wanted to, you could heal. DMC5 seems to have moved away from that system, and instead just floods each mission with an absurd number of green orb crystals. Now, I understand why they had to do this. I mean, you can no longer stock up on healing items beforehand, so there needs to be an adequate number of healing options somewhere else. That being said, I still think green orbs are far too common in DMC5, which is a shame as it removes a lot of the risk in combat, as there's almost always a crystal containing green orbs around the corner. Dante remains a powerhouse here. He even gets his own power up in the form of his Sin Devil Trigger and newly formed Devil Sword. This new weapon and form make short work of both Urizen and even make tougher boss fights like the one against King Cerberus far easier, as you're able to deal far more damage than usual. Thankfully, Urizen puts up a decent fight the second time around. He's got far more attacks this time around, and he spends most of the fight staying at range with his teleporting ability. He will frequently overlap his attacks, which can combo you for big damage if you're not paying attention. Even if you manage to dodge most of his attacks, all it takes is 1 or 2 big ones to chunk a decent portion of your HP. He was actually the first boss to take me down since Goliath back in Mission 2. I did manage to beat him the next attempt, which led to the big reveal that V and Urizen were 2 parts of Virgil all along. It seems like no matter what, all paths lead to Virgil. On our way, we have to take care of V's shadows though, which can be fairly annoying, especially when you have to face all 3 of them at the same time. But the fact that they turn into their core form when damaged enough definitely eases some of the pressure and difficulty that this fight could have had they stayed in their animal forms the whole time. With them defeated though, there remains one final challenge as usual. Now, By this point, I had faced Virgil multiple times. Sure, they were all in previous games, but they were still Virgil. Safe to say I was fairly confident going into this fight, especially when I recognized a lot of the attacks he was using. Honestly, my first attempt seemed to be going well. I got him down to about 50 HP and...
Oh shit. Oh fuck, man. Wait, what? That hit? Oh, for fuck's sake.
Yeah, this was going to be harder than I thought. As I said previously, getting him down to 50% is the easy part. Most of his attacks during this phase are reminiscent of his fight in DMC3. Rapid dash attacks? Check. Ranged judgment cuts? Check. Teleports behind you, nothing personal kit into numerous combo slashes? Check. All of these abilities are ones I've seen Virgil use in previous games, which made them significantly easier to dodge. Just like in DMC3 though, the real struggle begins once he enters his true Devil Trigger form. This guy just won't stop attacking in this form. It's like a constant stream of pressure, and if he so much as clips you, there's a good chance it'll turn into a combo and chunk your whole HP pool. If that wasn't bad enough, Virgil now has access to his Sin Devil Trigger, which is an even more powerful version of his standard Devil Trigger. But that's not where it ends. Once he drops down to 25% HP, he summons his Doppelganger, which attacks alongside them. If you're caught in either of their attacks, you're once again getting comboed for huge damage. Overall, he's one of the hardest bosses in the game, and the only one to kill me multiple times during this whole run. After our duel, we're stopped by Nero, who has unlocked his own true Devil Trigger form. We then have to face Virgil in one last duel, this time as Nero. Now, I'm not sure if this fight is supposed to be harder than the previous one, but I didn't struggle at all. Maybe it was because I had just fought Virgil 4 times or so, but I seemed to deal with him far better as Nero. I will say that Nero's newly restored arm does wonders in this fight, and with that, we have finished off the most recent entry in the DMC franchise. The game ends with Dante and Virgil cutting down the main route. At the end of DMC 5, I had died a total of 6 times. Because there are no healing items in this game, that means our total death count remains at 6. Now here's where we run into a bit of a problem. At the moment, this is how the games stack up in terms of difficulty, but it didn't sit quite right with me that DMC times 2 sat above DMC 5 as the harder game. After all, there was only one death that separated the two games, and while I played DMC times 2 on Nephilim mode, I had only played DMC 5 on Devil Hunter mode. Assuming I'd played DMC times 2 on Devil Hunter like I had the rest of the games, I'm sure I would have died less than 6 times. And for that reason and that reason alone, I will be making an executive decision which involves swapping the placements of DMC times 2 and DMC 5. That being said, what we truly care about is the hardest games. To no one's surprise, I'm guessing DMC 3 came out as the hardest of the bunch by quite a considerable margin. The game has some of the hardest bosses in the entire franchise, and while its levels are relatively short in comparison to the latter games, they contain some of the toughest enemy combinations in the entire franchise. DMC 1 is the only game that even comes close to DMC 3's difficulty, and while some of that difficulty can be attributed to the janky controls and scuffed camera, the large majority of it came down to the limited number of abilities Dante had access to. Most of the bosses in the game actively punish your mistakes, and if you don't learn how to avoid this damage, you'll most likely never be able to beat the game in the first place, which is something that I don't think I could say about DMC 2, DMC times 2, or DMC 5, all of which were relatively easy games. DMC 4, I think out of all of them, has a perfect difficulty scaling for a beginner player, and it probably had some of the best bosses alongside DMC 3 and DMC 5. The DMC franchise truly lives up to its title as the godfather of hack and slash games, and its difficulty is something I will never underestimate again. I want to thank you guys for watching if you've made it this far. If you enjoyed it, please do consider subscribing as it would mean a lot. Feel free to call me out for spamming combos early on. Like I said, I'm still a beginner, but you know, after these first playthroughs, I really do want to jump back in and play some of the harder difficulties. And with that, I hope you all have a lovely day, and I hope to see you all in the next one.